All right. Hello again. Welcome to another book study. We're now on is it chapter four or five? Four. Yes, thank you, Tim, of Embracing Alienation. This week, Greg is going to do the introduction to the chapter, which is really, I think, where we get into some meat of the political stuff. Where Todd sits in relation to Marxism and his kind of critique of that. And I kind of, at least I think, a good introduction to what he sees as a legitimate political project. So, Greg, can I hand over to you to do the introduction? And then after that, we'll just open up a general discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is definitely a pretty theoretically rich chapter. And you can really see that, McGowan here in this chapter, I think he's really kind of bridging this gap between sort of the arguments that he laid out in the first few chapters, explaining how he defines alienation and stuff like that. And now he is sort of shifting toward a much more specifically political way of interpreting this framework. Yeah, there's a lot here about Marx and Hegel and stuff. So it was kind of interesting to take this one on. I don't want to bore anybody with my own like biographical stuff, but it's kind of interesting for me because when I first joined up with this group a few years ago, it had dawned on me that like a lot of the people in this group, maybe even most people in this group, come from some kind of a religious background, like maybe some kind of evangelical background or something like that. And it was interesting for me because I didn't come from a religious background. I only came to some religious stuff much later in life. But I did come from a kind of Marxist ish background. So this chapter is very, I connected to it a lot because this kind of shift from like Marx to Hegel kind of mimics my own journey, as I've like been a part of this group. Because it's funny because actually, Pete, we met years ago in person, and it was a brief encounter. You had done this day long thing in New Jersey, where it was like a seminar during the day and then a pints and parables at night. And it was kind of very early of me finding your work, and I kind of came into it looking for a place where some of these religious ideas and these Marxist ideas can kind of intermingle. And we had a couple-minute conversation about how your work related to Marxist materialism way back. This was probably over almost 10 years ago at this point. But
Wow.
anyway, so that's how I kind of came into this. So that's why I thought this chapter was so kind of good because I've gone through this shift as well. So anyway, diving into it, I'm not going to go too deep into anything. I don't want to monopolize too much time, but I wanted to just kind of give an overview of I think what's kind of the main thing happening here in this chapter. And this is where McGowan is kind of situating his larger argument within the sort of the bigger philosophy, if you will. And he's really making the case here for Hegel and how Hegelian dialectics are really something that he thinks fits in with his entire, kind of thought process here with alienation. He says that Hegel is the first philosopher to really use alienation as a category and in a positive way, right? To speak of alienation as being something that is, a good thing. But for most of us, who have like engaged in philosophy and stuff like that, alienation is often a word that much more immediately gets associated with Marx, because Marx in his early days talked a lot about alienation, and for him, and this is what McGowan lays out in this chapter, Marx sees alienation as something that is sort of historical, like in a historical circumstance, the material circumstances of a particular time or a particular social system, like capitalism, generates alienation. And we can talk about it if we want to, his whole idea of like surplus value being turned into profit and then how it gets mystified. Like we can dive into that if there's anybody who wants to as we go through today. But to simplify it, for Marx, alienation is something that is created by a social system at a particular time, and it is something that can be and should be overcome. right? That alienation is a bad thing. It's a problem to be solved. And for Marx, there is a cure, and the cure is some kind of future communist society, right, that can do away with alienation. Where McGowan is kind of intervening here is to say that, you know, actually that's not the correct way of looking at it, right? And actually a return to Hegel, right? Marx was writing in response to Hegel, and McGowan is kind of calling for a return to Hegel. So there's a quote on page 91 that I thought was really good, and I'm going to read it to you all real quick. He says, it's at the very end of page 91. He says, those who call for an end to alienation want to achieve a society in which we overcome the distance between subjectivity and symbolic identity. In such a society, everyone would be recognized as who they are. There would be no gap internal to the subject or between subject and others. So this is kind of Marx. This would be communism for Marx, right? That we could, end this kind of commodified relationship between humans and nature, and so on. But he finishes here. Such a social order would, in Hegel's view, not only be impossible, it would also be a nightmare. So this is how he transitions from Marx to Hegel, where he says for Hegel, alienation is not a problem to be done away with. It is ontological, means it just exists. It is. You can find alienation, you can find contradiction in nature, right? And if you think anything through, eventually you will arrive at this kind of just internal contradiction. And he says that that's not a problem to get rid of, but it is something to embrace. It's something to dive deeper into. It is the alienation is the good news, right? It reveals hidden contradictions, and you don't solve a problem by proposing some kind of like outside alternative. He actually says Marx is more like a dualist in this, right? He says that instead of being more of a dialectician, right, Marx has capitalism and he proposes an alternative to capitalism, and that'll battle out, and whereas Hegel takes more of a position of, no, actually, we need to just go deeper into the contradictions that we see, right? And that is what's generative of knowledge. So essentially, and I want to bring it back to a political project, right? McGowan says that any political or social project should just double down on alienation, right? To see that the problem is the solution, right? As opposed to saying that here's this problem, here's alienation, we need to overcome it, and let's propose this kind of alternative utopia that will end the alienation. And he says that that's actually not the way to go about it. So for McGowan, any kind of political project, he says that ultimately the goal is inseparable from the means of achieving it. And he talks about, there's a quote I wrote down. He says, we are always arriving without getting there. Right. And so he says, we become who we are as we become different from what we are. And that ultimately it's not about, again, generating some kind of alternative utopia, right, that's going to end all alienation, but actually just creating a different way of relating to the present, which, and I'll kind of start to wrap it up here. We've been having some conversations back and forth on the WhatsApp. And there is sort of this general sense where we're like, okay, some of these ideas that McGowan puts forward, what does that actually look like in practice? What does a politics based on alienation look like? Is it even something how do you even begin to like articulate something like that? And I think that this line here at the end is really important. This idea that maybe it's not about necessarily finding some kind of positive alternative, but it's ultimately about finding new ways of relating to the present, right? Ways that we can act and live and be here now, and how that can be transformative ultimately. And I find this just on a personal level, kind of fascinating because, as I mentioned before, I knew a bit about Marx. I had studied Marx a lot, and I was very interested in like left politics, and I still am to a certain degree. And I've heard every argument against Marxism like under the sun, and I never found any of them to be all that convincing. but I do find McGowan's critiques to be quite convincing. And the things that McGowan or like Zizek and stuff would say about Marxism, I think is, that has been convincing for me. I'm sold on the kind of Hegelian critique of Marx. So I think there is something about dropping this kind of utopian dream, if you will, for lack of a better word, and kind of relating to this politics of embracing alienation, trying to step away from doubling down on these social identities, and instead doubling down on this alienation and finding different ways of relating to the present. You said in the past too, the idea of sort of, it's not about maybe finding a new relationship, but breaking up with the relationship you have while staying together. And I thought that kind of connected to this as well. So there's a lot, obviously, a very philosophically rich chapter. And I didn't even go into what he said about like Althusser and Lukács and stuff like that in the chapter, because I thought the Marx Hegel thing was the main draw of this chapter. But we can absolutely dive into any piece of this, unpack it a little bit. But I think ultimately what we come out of this chapter is this idea that there's two different visions. Like Marx and Hegel are very different. And for McGowan, Hegel is actually the radical thinker, right? Maybe not Hegel himself, who was quite conservative, but that there is a kind of radicality in his thoughts that Marx actually backed away from. And that maybe the best way forward, true emancipation, if you will, moving forward, would involve kind of returning to a Hegelian dialectics, embracing alienation, and finding new ways of just relating to the present, which he'll go into more detail in the next chapter. So that was helpful, a good introduction. Again, there's a lot to unpack, and I will open it up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. That was brilliant. Well done. I think you hit on all the main points. And yeah, I think you're right that you don't need to necessarily go into Lukács and Althusser and all of those kind of things. People stick up their hands or jump in. I'll say one thing just while people are thinking about their questions. So one of the things I think is really interesting about this chapter is near the end when he is kind of almost, I mean, it's almost a critique of Stalinism. He doesn't mention Stalin, but he does critique any project that has a clear vision of the future and therefore can justify pretty much doing anything in the present. Because if you're going to create the utopia, then of course you're justified in doing maybe not anything, but a lot of things in order to get there. But with this notion, which I like to call like an apocalypticist notion, is you don't know what the future is, so you can't have a clear idea. And this is how I read it anyway. You can't have a clear idea of the future. You don't know what the next stage of history is. All you can do is attempt to expose the contradictions that exist within the current structure. And that act in and of itself is the emancipatory move. So that, for me, that's the essence of this political project. And that's why it's a project of negativity. And I'll mention one thing on that. I actually heard a lecture today. It was very good. A guy called Tim Secret, I'd never heard of before, but he had a very good brief summary of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real in Lacan. And he kind of said, think of the symbolic, symbolic has cracks within it. And these cracks expose the real. And the imaginary is what we put over those cracks to stabilize the symbolic. So capitalism is the symbolic system, which creates contradictions. The contradictions are the real. And then we put fantasies over those fractures, blaming certain groups, whatever, to try to keep the system working. And therefore, in a McGowan type of political project, the idea is similar to what Lacan might say as traversing the fantasy, where you attempt to see the cracks that exist, that the imaginary realm is potentially obscuring. So yeah, so that for me is kind of the political project in a nutshell. So I just want to throw that in. And Jeff, jump in.
Thanks. I just wanted to comment. Thanks, Greg, for doing all that work. That was helpful. And I just on the point you just made about Stalin, or Stalinism, I'm very confused by this chapter. I'm confused by the book, but I'm confused for a lot of reasons. But I'm confused by this chapter specifically because he's drawing these distinctions between Marx and Hegel. And one of the things is when he's talking about alienation, I'm not even sure he's talking about the same thing. Like for Marx, it's a very different concept, I think, than it is for Hegel. And I think that might be an issue. And the other thing I just raised my hand to say was relative to Stalin and the ends justifying means and such. He does, in I think the previous chapter, hold up Franz Fanon as this sort of model of how to go about conceptualizing this different approach to politics. And Fanon is famously in support of violence. So I see that as kind of a small contradiction in the text that might indicate a greater contradiction in the practice. And I'm also not quite sure in terms of the alienation piece of this and the different approaches to it, what having the attitude towards alienation that McGowan attributes to Hegel, and I think rightly, what that would change in the political practice of Marx, what that would actually look like. So thanks.
Greg, do you want to respond to any of that?
I mean, I have to I think that's a really good point. Like, especially, and I think that's something worth talking about. Like, is Marx's conception of alienation very different from Hegel's and McGowan's, and maybe he's sort of conflating these two terms in a way that don't work. And I hadn't thought about that really before. So I think that that's worth kind of pondering it over. And I don't know if John, I know John has commented on the WhatsApp about like one of your concerns is maybe McGowan is using some of these terms just too lightly, or maybe not necessarily situating them properly in their context. And so maybe this is an issue. And I guess briefly, all that I would say is that I think one of McGowan's main points is that even if Marx does kind of mean something different about alienation, it does seem as though Marx does conceive of the fact that it is something that can be overcome and we can achieve a society in which, this alienation is gone and everybody can be sort of, I don't know, and there's an end to exploitation, you know what I mean? People can live in a much more harmonious, relations with nature, with each other. So, I think ultimately Marx, there is this component of like, even though Marx would totally reject being called a utopian, he tried very hard, to avoid that. I still think it's there though. And I think that that's the main thing McGowan has an issue with. But I would love to hear from some others.
I'll say something very quick about that, and then John, you jump in. Uh, if comparing and contrasting McGowan's notion with Marx's notion, then is in a way McGowan has said elsewhere as well in Capitalism and Desire that the issue with capitalism is not that it exploits and that it creates alienation, but that this exploitation and alienation is repressed and not distributed well. So potentially a different approach where the critique of Marx kicks in is by saying that the very thing that often Marxists critique capitalism for is missing the mark because of this kind of notion of a beyond of alienation, but that in a way sacrifice and work and the creation of surplus is not the problem. The problem with capitalism is that it kind of it obscures the value of sacrifice in and of itself and promises a solution to it. So I don't know. I think that's where it's interesting to me, is that often pure Marxist critiques of capitalism do seem to aim at the very thing that McGowan is saying is not the problem with capitalism. In other words, capitalism exposes drive. That's not the issue. But anyway, I'm not saying very much there. John, jump in, or actually, sorry, Jeff, you're nodding your head. Do you want to say anything before John jumps in?
No, that does make sense. And it reminds me of Seminar 16, what Lacan is saying there about surplus jouissance. I think that's kind of similar to what you're saying.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Cheers. John, go for it.
I'm going to try to ease us into the criticism today. So I'm going to start out slow and then maybe just ratchet up the volume a little bit. But I really wanted to jump in just to echo what Jeff said previously, because that's one of the most frustrating things for me in reading through this text, is I don't know how it is that McGowan is using these terms. And so I'm trying to reconstruct them back from a hodgepodge of different philosophers that he's moving in between. And I'm doing like a deep dive through Lacan's seminars now, so I don't mean to like reify Lacan as some sort of truth, but I'm thinking in a very Lacanian way lately. And like there's something of the way that he interprets here. He says that you should interpret analysis that I think is pertinent here, because Lacan's central focus and what he revolutionizes, I think, in psychoanalytic practice is saying that you can't treat the signifiers that arise in analysis based on your own imaginary conceptions of what they mean, because each individual has their own imaginary constellation of signification. So, when one person hears a word like freedom or emancipation or alienation, they have their own signification. And so what you need to do in analysis is to see how the signifiers are related to one another, are structured in this chain of association, and what are the significations that the signifieds, the imaginary meaning that gets pulled along with this. And I think from that perspective, I almost feel like McGowan is doing sort of like an imaginary analysis in the sense that other psychoanalysts would do. It's like he's looking at Marx and he's looking at Feuerbach, or he's looking at Hegel and he's looking at Lacan, and he sees a word like alienation or freedom in there, and then he's kind of imputing his own imaginary conception of what that means to it. And it's not so much that that's necessarily wrong, but I think somehow the logic needs to be spelled out a little more, because I don't like, and I think, Greg said this, and maybe there's something that remains under the surface. Jeff repeated this, said this first. Like, what alienation, because of the structural relations that a term like alienation takes on in Feuerbach, is different from the signification that it takes on in Hegel, and it's different from the significations that it takes on in Marx, and just shifting between it so effortlessly. Like, I understand this is more of a popular book and everything, so I don't really, maybe it's not particularly a fair criticism, but there's something that, knowing this material, it's almost like an illegal imaginary move or something.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Marx himself kind of felt that in this chapter, McGowan mentions that, like, Marx himself felt that he was not really changing, well, in one sense, not changing anything, just putting Hegel back on his feet, and taking the dialectic into the material realm out of the ideal realm. But Marx himself thought that he was continuing with the Hegelian dialectic in material form. But is that too,
Well, I think it's that Marx never uses alienation that I can think of, and my German has to improve, so I do want to read the original one day. But from reading, unfortunately, reading just through the translations, I can't remember. Right, for him, it's always this sort of negative political category. Whereas in Hegel, it's an abstract philosophical concept that doesn't necessarily have negative connotations, right? So the basic example is in Hegel, he uses language like, I think it's in Philosophy of Nature, the second part of the encyclopedia, that he basically says like God alienates himself in creating the world because there's a material versus the ideal. There's some measure of disjunction between these two. There's some measure. That's why the word alienation, I think, is used. But sort of emanation, creating the material world, that's not quite the same sense of alienation that Marx is using when he critiques the means of production and the way that it separates the laborer from the means of the means of their the product of their labor. Right? Marx doesn't really use it in that abstract philosophical sense, and like if you were just going to ask Marx or something like if he was going to use the Hegelian language and say like I don't know the laborer in creating a product alienates himself just in this philosophical sense by creating something material against the ideal product, like he might just say yeah that's a form of alienation, but it's not how I kind of use it in this social sense.
Bill, jump in.
Yeah, thanks. Good comments. Just a quick question, because Bluey is playing in the background. Pete, is there something more in terms of the political project than just identifying contradiction? So it seems like that's saying, no, that's wrong, no, that's wrong. Kind of like, it almost sounds too skeptical, but is there ever something, okay, so maybe we should do this, which is different than here's the sure way to salvation, but I don't normally associate politics with just pointing out contradictions or no, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, I'll say something on that, and then I'd be interested, yeah, in Greg responding, and then I have a question for John on that as well. Is Yeah, there's a little moment in the chapter where McGowan kind of says that, well, I see it as two things. One is pure philosophy for me is a type of just you raise the contradiction. And I almost go like that feels like a very pure thing. But then there's a little hint in it as well where McGowan goes like to do, one has to make political stances, do things. And it's not, there's a line in there, I'm sure, that basically it's not that, in relation to bringing up the contradictions, a political, I suppose, act one might risk a political act. He doesn't quite say it that way, but that's why I hear it is like there's the pure raising of the contradictions, and then there may occasionally be one has to, in fear and trembling, try to act in fidelity to that. Maybe that's what Todd's saying. But I very strongly think that Todd at his best is basically saying that anytime, and Zizek says this, anytime we try to imagine what the future utopia is, we're just basically reifying some present vision. And so we have to be very careful to go, the owl of Minerva spreads her wings at dusk. We are very careful to say we only know in retrospect. That's what I think Todd's saying, which in one sense I would have thought might answer some of John's concerns. Whereas in that, if Todd is true to his own vision, he shouldn't be offering certain political answers. But I don't know if that's the case. But anyway, Greg, jump in, and then I'd love to hear John on that.
So I mean, just
Bill.
before that, I mean, so no, not the extreme of certain, because you use the word certain, but more the Hegelian notion of like, okay, you say this, but maybe how about this? And there's truth in both, and so then we'll kind of do sublation to this, but we won't be foolish enough to think that's the ultimate solution. So it's more the Hegelian progress thing.
What could you say it again? Sorry, like are you defining how the process looks in practice there?
Well, I mean, unlike the typical politician who says, "Here's the one thing we have to do to ensure everything will be great," Hegel is not like that. Hegel is like, well, we know this, and let's study it some more. Oh, now we've discovered this interesting position that doesn't seem to reconcile. So it's more of this we learn as we go, which is different than saying, oh, we finally have the perfect candidate or perfect, political agenda.
Yeah.
So just point out contradictions seems a little too passive, a little too like throwing stones from the back of the peanut gallery. But I think, and of course, Todd being super Hegelian is, well, no, you do this, and then you look at the opposite view, and there's validity in both positions, and you kind of say, okay, what can we learn from that? And then you keep moving, keep moving, keep moving.
And or it could be, this might be similar to what you're saying, but in psychoanalysis, the idea, at least for a neurotic, is when you show the contradictions and the hidden enjoyments of the contradiction, the enjoyment is therefore robbed of it, and it kind of provokes a change. So in some respects, you might say that you're trying to expose the hidden enjoyments, say, of capitalism, the repressed contradictions, and just by, in some respect, bringing all of that to the surface, evokes a transformative event. But I don't know, yeah. Greg, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, so Bill, it's a really good question, and even kind of going back to sort of one of John's initial critiques as well is that it's difficult because ultimately, I mean, I'm no Hegel scholar. I've attempted the phenomenology twice, and I've made it part of the way through. I've never done the whole thing. But as far as I understand, Hegel's really not that interested in creating any kind of political philosophy at all, right? Hegel is just interested in trying to understand, the truth of, the universe or whatever, right? So, Todd is making so Todd and like Zizek and all, like, part of their contribution is to try to pull something political out of Hegel that wasn't necessary, that like Hegel wasn't advocating for. But your question of what does Todd say that, we should do with this? So on the one hand, I would say, like, stay tuned, right? Because I have read the next chapter, and he does present more concrete examples of what he's talking about. But I also don't get your hopes up because there's not a whole lot there either. He's ultimately going to just insist on defending the public or the commons. He's going to really insist on this idea of just an absolute fighting for the preservation of the spaces where we are forced into an encounter with the other, and resist the urge in society to essentially privatize everything and for us to retreat into our own particular communities as much as possible. But just to kind of echo a little bit of what Pete was saying a minute ago too, he also does insist that, like, just like sort of reading Hegel is itself a kind of political act, right? And that if we all, I guess, as individuals recognize the sort of insights that come from Hegelian philosophy, then we are going to be hopefully less likely to be kind of, what word am I looking for? Attracted to that call that, to whatever this political project might be of the left or the right or anybody that promises you an end to alienation. That I guess there is something in the idea of embracing these ideas and understanding them, and then we may be less likely to be persuaded by those kind of voices that are promising you some kind of a society. So for him, there is something political in that as well,
including a critique of capitalism, because if capitalism runs on a libidinal investment in something that will overcome alienation, then indirectly, yes, it's a critique of contemporary capitalism. If you read the libidinal drive of capitalism as one of trying to overcome contradiction through the commodity or whatever. So yeah, very well said.
If I could jump in for a second, isn't it fair to say that what we're speaking to with this McGowan's work and his interpretation of Hegel is a very specific one that isn't necessarily one that's been traditionally in circles of philosophy, that it's not necessarily one that's throughout, the last 100 years been embraced the most. Like, I feel like we're coming in, I think when you're in Peter, your work, or Zizek, for me, it's been important to recognize that this is a very specific interpretation, one that I really resonate with and that I find so productive. But since I'm not from a philosophical background, have no formal training in it, it's important for me to frame that so that when I come to talk to other people, they like literally are like, what are you even talking about? Like, the way you're using that word isn't how I've ever heard it used. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment.
Yes, very good, very good. And yes, the interpretation of Hegel that we're all kind of talking about here, you're exactly right, is was not the predominant interpretation, and still isn't. But yes, so yeah, that's very worth bearing in mind. Greg, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yes, no, I absolutely love that, Karen. Because I don't know if anybody, we did a book study of, did we do, what's the Hegel book that he wrote? Why am I blanking on the name of it? Anyway, he wrote a book on Hegel, and I don't know why I can't think of it
Emancipation
right.
After Hegel?
Thank you. Emancipation After Hegel. I think we did a book study on that in this
We
group
did.
at one point in time. So anyway, one of the things that Todd says is that essentially there was Hegel, and people had read Hegel for a very long time. But ultimately, it's with, I think, really, like, Slavoj Žižek is one of the pioneers of this, is that with the language of psychoanalysis, we can then kind of reinterpret Hegel, right? Like, McGowan actually makes this argument that, like, the reason why no one understands Hegel is because Hegel didn't have the language of psychoanalysis at the time, right? And if he had only had the language of psychoanalysis at the time, maybe he would have written it differently and it could have been understood a little bit differently. At least that's how he interprets it. So yes, absolutely. Like, this is a particular interpretation of Hegel through Lacan, so to speak. And there is, I guess it's the Ljubljana school is what they call it. There's a sort of, I guess, based out of Slovenia, a number of, like, philosophers and thinkers that use this interpretive framework. So, like, yeah, Karen, you bring up a really good point.
John, jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to put some stuff in the chat and trying to multitask. It didn't come through yet. Well, look, see, and you asked me this in I think the pyrotheology group chat, which you have to change the name to Inferno because I'm starting to get confused of which is Blaze and which is, like, one's Blaze and then one's just generic of pyrotheology. So when I'm scrolling through the different groups, I get confused which is which. But you asked me this, if you think that Zizek falls prey to the same critique that I have of McGowan, and I think I maybe at certain moments, but I think Zizek does something a little different than McGowan because I don't think Zizek's concept of freedom is necessarily the same, and I don't think his conception of alienation and the way that he mobilizes that is the same. I mean, there are so many videos you can find that he probably says this in a book somewhere, but Zizek has like 30 books, and it's hard to remember where he says anything. Sometimes he says it 5 times, thank God. So, but
You say 30,
he uses the same.
for like 100. It's crazy.
Unfortunately, right? I haven't been able to keep up with some of the new ones, but but there's plenty of videos where he talks about like radical democracy or something, and his counterposition to this is always that no, what he doesn't really want something like radical democracy because there is no unmediated sort of democratic freedom he doesn't believe in, and he always posits something like an alienated bureaucratic structure that just sort of works in the background and runs society smoothly, and then you just sort of get to live your normal life. And I feel like that sort of relationship to the big other, to the symbolic system, is completely different than that of McGowan, because I think that McGowan would see that as a form of unfreedom, but I think Zizek would problematize it a little bit more. It takes away some of your freedom, while it probably gives you a certain freedom to live your life. I forget who it's by. I think was it the guy who wrote Public Opinion? Why am I blanking on his name? But there's some guy from I think it was the 1920s, 1930s. He said, socialism is, democratic socialism. He said something like would be wonderful, except it's one endless meeting after another. Because if you have to run everything in society, if everybody has to show up and get to vote, like that would be a nightmare. And I think, so I think Zizek has that sort of basic critique, is that you need a symbolic system that just kind of works in the background. Um, and I think Zizek's idea of the symbolic is a lot more, doesn't necessarily, I don't seem to have the same problem when I read Zizek, really.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I see them so closely aligned sometimes, but I'm going to think about that and what you're saying. Anybody else want to jump in? And if not, John, you're welcome to push a little bit further if you have something you want to, a thread you want to pull a little bit more. Maybe not.
Put the pressure on me.
Yeah, well, have a think. Have a think.
I'll jump in while John thinks, because his thinking scares me just a bit, but in a good way. Okay. You guys are talking all this wonderful theory with Marx and Hegel. I guess I'm a little more pedestrian when I came out of the chapter thinking in terms of like our current political environment in America, and the whole idea of the not the emancipation, but actually the alienation that exists in our political landscape right now is so stark. There's just this, both sides are trying to say we will solve the problem of alienation, basically. We're both I don't think we admit we're alienated. I don't think either side would recognize that as inherent in who we are fighting with each other to be, but it's that idea of thinking, okay, well, if this side wins, then they're going to solve alienation this way. If the other side wins, they're going to win it that way. And what I hear out of this chapter, I think, and this is what I want to, I guess, pose as a question, is McGowan saying, in light of this, if we were to put this situation in his filter, is he saying that we need to press in and let this bomb blow up? I mean, we need to kind of press in to let the conflict in this issue be what it's going to be, whatever it's going to be. Somewhat like you said, Pete, apocalyptically, like we don't know what this is going to turn out to be, no matter who wins. It's going to be, unpredictably, possibly very chaotic either way. And is that something to embrace as a level of emancipation, to say, we're going to have the freedom to analyze, respond, and see what comes next? And that is emancipation. Am I kind of getting this in more of a practical application, or am I kind of missing where this flow is headed?
No, yeah, this is very good. And I saw Bill mention the very term I was going to use, because I am always in danger of, in danger, not even the right word, but accelerationism, some form of accelerationism, which is the view that you just want to, in one sense, bring the contradiction to its absolute explosive point and allow the future to unfold. Is McGowan here a version of accelerationism? In some respects, he's not saying that we should accelerate the contradiction, but he wants to expose the contradiction. And I have to say, mostly when it comes to party politics, I see all party politics as an attempt to avoid alienation, et cetera, et cetera. And so if I ever engage in party politics, which is very rarely, it's usually I'm just looking for what move exposes contradiction most, which doesn't mean necessarily voting for the person I like most. But yeah, you're raising some interesting questions. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on accelerationism or McGowan on that.
I just want to ask Tim, say more about that. Your thought that maybe we should experience, well, it's a particle sun, basically, right?
Perhaps. I think we have just evolved to a certain place culturally, unlike where we were as recently as 10 years ago. I mean, what we've become in the last 4 to 8 years is so culturally alienation. I mean, I think it exposes who we are as people too, because I'm trying to separate myself from some of the social media that's out there, and certainly regular media, that there's so much discussion about this. What are the polls saying? Who's doing what? And it can be super anxious, makes me super anxious. And I'm thinking, why am I anxious about this? That's one question. But secondly, if I read McGowan right, it's exposing my own personal alienation, that I am not at one with my own feelings or beliefs about a very, unpredictable landscape right now. So, that's good. And for me to confront that, I suppose, or to allow myself to be emancipated in that experience, is to kind of embrace the alienation that's being exposed, either in me personally or in our nation politically. And to therefore feel a freedom of, to some degree, anxiety, to not be so libidinally invested in the outcome. It's like, it's going to be what it's going to be. I've got my vote. I know who I'm going to vote for. Strap in and hang on, because whatever the result will be chaotic. I mean, no matter who wins, there's going to be chaos. Okay. And so rather than fearing that and saying, oh, how can we prevent that? Or how can people be so stupid? Just say, this is part of who we are. This is part of being human in what we've created, if you will, the consequences of American democracy over 250 years. This is who we've become. And so, yeah, it makes my head explode to see how some people think about certain people and issues. I don't understand how you get to that place reasonably, and then that to me is no longer an issue. It's like they're covering up their own alienation by grabbing onto something that they think prevents the alienation. And in reality, it's just going to expose it further. So those are just my personal thoughts on it. But I'm trying to find a place in 10 days to be ready for that next level. Sure, go ahead, John.
Can I just ask and be a bastard again? Like, in what sense do you think you're using the term alienation here? The Hegelian, the Marxist, or the Lacanian?
Well, that might be a little over my head, not of my pay grade. I guess simply to answer that from a very simple point of view is just that I feel like it's that whole idea of not at oneness, the anxiety that I cannot find a place of peace in this particular issue, but it spreads out to every issue in life, as far as I'm concerned. It's that recognition of dividedness and that division is centered in many ways on my perception of the other, whatever that other is, the other person, the other party, the other country, whatever that other is that influences who I perceive myself to be, that I cannot find a comfortable oneness with, is ontologically present.
So something I'm reminded of when I'm listening to you speak, actually, and make a quick connection, and I'll jump to you guys, Greg and Jeff, is I've had a few dreams recently. I'm doing psychoanalysis, and I've had a few dreams that have been very disturbing, not in the content, but in the feeling, in the affect. So I've had, and I think it's been part of my analysis. Something's kind of come up, and of course, at the most distressing moment of the dream, I wake up. And you're making me think that in some respects, in Lacanian analysis, you're kind of interested in what was the last image in the dream before you woke up, because you almost woke up because you're so close to something, so you're so close to the real, your anxiety is being produced, and you kind of wake up. And without wanting to apply that to American society, you kind of go like, the amount of kind of anxiety that's around these elections and the political landscape. It feels like one could make the argument that we're at a point where the contradiction could erupt. This is actually evidence of the possibility of an event. And things might calm down, and just like you wake up and you go, whatever, and maybe afterwards it won't. But there's a possibility that it's just like my dreams. We're on the edge of something that could erupt in a positive way. I don't know, but I just see when I hear you talk, the anxiety that I see in America around everything, going like, is this because we're so close to the real, to the contradiction of the current system? Um, but Greg, jump in. And by the way, we're kind of coming up to the last 10, 15 minutes. So stick up your virtual hands and get into the queue, and we'll see everybody before we go. Greg.
Yeah, time flies. I kind of have two things that I want to jump in on. Like, so Tim, I think like we have recognized, and I think that John really did us all a big service here by like pointing out that like, you know, there might be very different ways that alienation as a term is being used. And I think that that is definitely something for us to keep in mind moving forward. But I also think, Tim, your response was really good in the sense that, like, is there something that maybe all three of these different ways of using alienation have in common? You know, and maybe there is something to this idea of it's just this fundamental not at oneness. I feel separated from myself, from my labor, from my fill in the blank. And then the fact that there is a danger that somebody can kind of come along, or just a danger that you believe that that can be rectified. And I think that that's like McGowan's main point, is just this idea of, you know, even though alienation might be used differently in different contexts, at a fundamental level, it's the idea that there's a rupture that can be fixed, that it's a problem in need of a solution. It's a sickness in need of a cure. And he's trying to push against that. He's trying to say that, like, that for McGowan and for Hegel, alienation is just, it's primary, it's foundational, you can't get rid of it, and it's not a problem in need of a cure. And so that's where he thinks Marx errs, because Marx, even though he might be using alienation differently, he sees it as a problem in need of a cure, and he proposes some kind of a cure. So I think you're right, Tim. The second thing I would say really fast about McGowan and politics, I don't know that I can't speak for him. I don't know him. You know what I mean? I don't know what's in his mind necessarily. But what I've pieced together from his work is I don't know that he would be an accelerationist. I think that he has very much a critique of the kind of liberal left, but I think that he also recognizes that there's a certain element of like harm reduction, that, you know, and he is very much committed to like the state. So I mean, I think that if I had to bet on it, I would say that he's going to vote Democrat in the next election, you know, and that he recognizes that there is, you know, one political party is more interested in protecting the commons, the public, than the other. And he very much wants to push back against what he sees as the real corporatizing. And I think for him, the Republican Party represents that a little bit more. But again, I can't speak for him. His big political contribution lately has been to put forward enjoyment as a political category. And he thinks that both the left and the right have their own form of enjoyment. And that's what operates or motivates them politically. And that the key to politics moving forward is to expose these forms of enjoyment for what they are, and hopefully sort of undermine, I guess, maybe their both positions from within. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there.
Thank you. Jeff, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of get on the Tim train regarding the sort of application of this to like the current scene, because I think it does resonate pretty intensely when you apply it to, because when I was reading this, one of the thoughts I had was this would seem very applicable to me as a critique of like identity politics. And, you know, I thought about that a little bit and was kind of like, well, you know, we've got all these things. And one of the things that might be universal for everybody is being queer, because we're all kind of queer. And yeah, I would say, excuse the sirens. Yeah, I think given the sort of like unhappy situation we're in here in the States, and the sort of unhappy choices we're presented with, both sides in terms of alienation seem to be kind of dug in and alienated. Well, not alienated in the Hegelian sense. They seem to be seeking the cure for alienation in such extreme forms that it's hard to know. And I do think what Tim was saying is spot on with respect to that.
John, do you want to jump in?
There was like a whole bunch of people in front of me in the queue, and now I just somehow jumped up. I don't know. Does somebody?
I think Tim
Does
jumped,
somebody?
ducked out. Did you duck out on purpose, Tim? Okay.
Oh God. Okay. So see, we're running out of time, so I don't want to do too much of this now. Maybe it's best to try to save the meat of it for the next time when we finish the last chapter. But the, I think that the problem that I keep coming back to is the particular relationship between alienation and freedom in McGowan. And it's not that it's wrong per se. I don't think. I think that it's the angle that it's looked upon that I think it's the value that's attached to it that's a little at variance with, I would argue, both Hegel and Lacan. Because look, he's missing a step in the argument because he has the master signifier of freedom, and because he's trying to, I think, show that alienation leads to freedom, which is the architectonics of the book, I suppose. Um, I don't think that's the way that Hegel and Lacan imagine the situation. And I posted this long block quote in the chat from Hegel. I have you to blame now for not getting my dissertation writing done as best as I can, because I'm trying to get through Hegel, and now these all week all this stuff is circulating around in my mind. But like the quote that I gave, that one of the ways that Hegel, or I would say probably the main social political way that Hegel imagines alienation, is that you is it this, let's call it the symbolic. He calls it objective spirit, right? Sometimes he calls it culture. There's a whole different vocabulary that we don't have to get lost in. The quote I gave is from Phenomenology of Spirit, by the way. Um, and there's like a nice little paragraph mark if anybody has it and wants to look it up further. But one of the ways that Hegel's imagining alienation is that alienation, by giving yourself over to an alienated being, to something that stands opposed to you, you sort of get pulled out of your own inane particularity. There's the difference between particularity, your individuality, your sort of just special givenness, is a very big problem for Hegel, and I think it's a problem for Lacan too, because of his idea of the imaginary. Right, that the imaginary is the opposite of the symbolic, and it's based on basically a schizoid, sort of paranoid type of position, like Melanie Klein. And the way that Hegel, in the phenomenology at least, is sort of positioning social alienation is that giving yourself over to this universal being that comes from the symbolic order, that comes from objective spirit, you sort of you're alienated because you're pulled out of your own useless sort of particular nature and subjected to something that's higher than you, right? The law, objective spirit. And therefore, you kind of find your true being in the other being by being subjected to something that's higher than you. Um, and I think there's something of that in Lacan too, because Lacan sees, right, the overcoming of the imaginary, this idea that you would be locked in this master-slave dialectic, if not for if not for the imposition of the symbolic order. This is why if you don't have the name of the father, you become psychotic essentially. And I don't that is for both Hegel and Lacan. I don't think the primary operating category and what's at stake is freedom as what's driving this process. And I think like I said, I've been thinking about this all week, so you're to blame for that. And but I think if you just subtracted freedom from the equation, the argument would look very different. And I think, like, coming back to it over and over again in my mind, I think that's the primary problem that I have, because for both Hegel and Lacan, I think freedom is primarily the freedom of the other and the freedom of the symbolic order, objective spirit in Hegel. It's not the freedom of the individual. So I think there's like an inversion. I'm trying to stand McGowan on his head, essentially, you could say, to borrow Marx. I think he has something backward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, definitely want to think about that, because McGowan's notion of freedom, from what I can tell, is freedom is the name for what erupts out of contradiction. So it's freedom is obviously it's
Right.
yeah. So
But it's specifically, but the problem is that he's imagining it as the way that McGowan presents the argument, he's still imagining that there's an individual that's disidentified with the symbolic. He's not seeing it as the negativity of the symbolic system itself, the way he speaks. It's the relationship between the individual and the symbolic determination that I think is the problem for me. It's like, it's not the negativity of objective spirit in itself. It's sort of this gap between the individual and the symbolic system that negativity is generated. And I think for both Hegel and Lacan, I think the negativity is in the symbolic order itself.
yeah, but then would McGowan make a distinction between the individual and the subject, where he'd say the subject, yeah, isn't free. The individual isn't free. The subject is the coagulation of contradiction, and therefore, yeah, the subject is free, but not the individual. I don't know if there's something in that. I'm going to have to think about what you're saying. I think there's something good in what you're saying. I'm just trying to figure it out in my own head here. Because in a sense, McGowan would say, like with Sapanchik, I like the term, we are the Tourette's of the universe, but the subject is this explosion that erupts out of the non-coincidence of the symbolic world with itself.
I think that if you pressed, right, I think if you asked him that directly, I think he would probably agree. I don't know if that's what comes through in the text, though.
Yeah. Very
Hey
good.
Pete, do you have any
If that's
pull to
fair.
get Todd McGowan to join us? Because I know when we did Capitalism and Desire, he was able to log on for a session and take questions. I would, if we were able to pull that up, I would love for John to be able to ask him directly some of these questions.
Oh, that would be great, and I'm sure Todd would do it. I'm more than happy to ask him to jump on the last week. Not John. You don't have to be put on the spot. John's the guy, he hates you, Todd. So he's going to attack you for the next 30 minutes. We won't do that to you.
You
yeah,
can if you want to be cruel that day. It's up to you. However you get your enjoyment, you know.
exactly, absolutely. Okay, I'll ask Todd to join us. That'll be fun. Any final thoughts then from anybody before we close up? Okay.
Who's going to do next week leading?
Well, so next week is para seminar, so we've got a little bit of time before the next.
No. I mean that the next chapter. Who's going to give the summary of the next chapter?
Yeah, I was wondering whether I should do it. I was wondering whether I should do one and then someone else and then me and someone else, or we're happy to keep moving around. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure how people feel about that. I'd be very happy to give it over to somebody else if anybody.
I think Tim and Greg, both Tim and Greg did excellent jobs, but if you want to do the next one, but like Greg, especially Greg was a really good person to do this chapter because it's Marx and that's his background. So if you think you have a great fit with the next chapter, great.
Great. Well, Bill, in light of what you said, because I was thinking this going like, oh, should I do, either one on or one off or a couple in one? But I really like hearing other voices myself. And if people are enjoying that, I would go, maybe, is there somebody who feels they would like to tackle the commons next week, which would either be Karen, Jeff, or Bill out of this group? Because or John, you haven't done one yet. I think if you haven't done one because of your critiques, but yeah, but you haven't. So any of you would be more than welcome.
I like the outside.
I love comments, but I will nominate Karen because Karen's got that experience with some collective.
I'd be happy to do it.
Would you be happy to do it?
Yeah.
Cool. And John, what were you going to say? Sorry, were you going to suggest somebody?
I said I like being the outsider perspective, so I feel like I should get a pass on this.
Perfect. Well, then, Karen, thank you so much for volunteering. You're stop. Wonderful. Okay. Hopefully I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.